Chosen one, there is a quiet truth that most people never hear clearly enough to believe. It is the truth that your path was never meant to look like everyone else's struggle. What you have endured was not punishment, but preparation for something greater in motion. And now, as if the world itself has shifted its weight, a new current begins to move toward you. Not by accident, but by alignment with what has always been waiting for you to step into. You are separated so you could be prepared in silence, not shaped by the noise of the world. There is a strange mercy in being taken away, even temporarily, from what others call normal life, because it is in that removal that something deeper begins to form within you. It is not merely distance from people or circumstances, but distance from distraction itself, as though existence gently pulled you aside to prevent your attention from being scattered across things too small for your destiny. In that quiet separation, what the world calls delay begins to reveal itself as design, and what felt like abandonment starts to resemble a careful kind of guardianship that does not announce itself loudly. You may have noticed how certain seasons of your life felt stripped, almost bare, as if the usual confirmations of progress were withheld from you. Yet that stripping was not emptiness in the way fear interprets it, but preparation in the way wisdom understands it. A vessel cannot be filled properly if it is already occupied by noise, expectations, and borrowed identities. So the silence was not passive, it was active shaping, like a craftsman refining a tool away from the eyes of the crowd. And in that hidden work, something within you was being made less dependent on applause and more capable of endurance, less attached to immediate reward, and more attuned to meaning that unfolds slowly over time. There is also a peculiar loneliness that often accompanies such separation, not because you are unloved, but because you are being taught to stand without constant validation. It is in that space that thoughts deepen, perception sharpens, and inner conviction begins to form its own backbone. Many would misinterpret this as being forgotten, yet it is closer to being reserved. Reserved not for absence, but for timing that has not yet arrived, as though your life has been placed in a quiet holding pattern where nothing is wasted and nothing is random. Even your unanswered questions were quietly doing their work, stretching your awareness beyond what comfort would have allowed. And so, in hindsight, the separation begins to resemble a kind of hidden apprenticeship, where the lessons are not spoken aloud but embedded into experience itself. You are learning how to move without constant reassurance, how to continue without immediate proof, how to trust patterns that are not yet visible. The world outside may have seemed to progress without you, but within that hidden space something far more foundational was being established, as though unseen hands were aligning internal architecture for a future that requires stability rather than haste, depth rather than display, and a quiet strength that does not collapse under sudden change, not a denial of your worth, but a quiet and deliberate refinement of it, as though time itself has been instructed to act not as a judge, but as a sculptor who understands that what is rushed often breaks under its own weight. Delay, in this deeper sense, is never an absence of movement. It is movement concealed beneath the surface where foundations are being laid that cannot yet be seen without the risk of misunderstanding. What you experienced as waiting was, in truth, a careful adjustment of timing, as if reality itself refused to release you into outcomes before you were internally able to sustain them without collapse. There is a tendency in the human mind to interpret pauses as rejection, because the visible world rewards speed and punishes stillness with doubt. Yet there are forms of preparation that cannot be accelerated without distortion, much like a seed that refuses to become a tree on command, not because it lacks desire, but because it is bound to a deeper order that protects it from premature exposure. In that same way, your delays were not interruptions of your path, but protections placed upon it, ensuring that when movement finally came, it would not destroy what it was meant to build within you. If you look closely at those moments that felt like stagnation, you may notice that something invisible was being strengthened in parallel with your patience. Resilience was being taught not as theory, but as lived experience, and endurance was being formed not through encouragement, but through necessity. You were being introduced to a kind of inner gravity that does not depend on external affirmation, a gravity that keeps a soul steady even when surroundings offer no confirmation that progress is occurring at all, and it is often in such periods that the most essential recalibration takes place, where desires are quietly purified from noise, ambition is separated from desperation, and purpose begins to detach itself from imitation. What remains is something more stable, though less easily explained, a direction that does not shout but persists, even when everything else appears uncertain. Delay, therefore, becomes less like a barrier and more like a filter, removing what cannot endure what is coming, preserving only what is capable of carrying weight without breaking under it. There is also a strange mercy in how delay forces a kind of inward honesty, because when external progress slows, internal truth becomes unavoidable. You begin to notice what was previously hidden beneath distraction, the assumptions you carried, the dependencies you never questioned, the fragile foundations upon which expectations were built. And in confronting these quietly, without spectacle or validation, something is slowly rewritten within you, not by force, but by exposure to stillness that does not flatter but reveals even the frustration that accompanied those delays was not wasted, for it carved depth into your perception, teaching you to distinguish between what is merely urgent and what is truly necessary. In time, you begin to understand that what is withheld is not always removed, and what is postponed is not always denied, but held in reserve until the conditions within you are no longer fragile, until your capacity has expanded enough to hold what once would have overwhelmed you. The doors that closed were never your destination, only protection from lesser paths. And if you could see them now, not through the memory of disappointment, but through the lens of later understanding, you would notice something almost merciful in their timing. What once appeared as rejection was, in truth, a quiet redirection, as though existence itself had stepped in with a firmness you did not recognize at the time, not to deny you entry into your life, but to prevent your life from shrinking into something too small to contain what was being prepared within you. There is a certain blindness in the moment of closure, because the human heart tends to assign meaning based on immediate loss rather than long-term design. When a door shuts, the mind instinctively assumes finality, as if what is blocked is also what is lost forever. Yet not every opening is meant to receive you, and not every opportunity carries within it the architecture capable of sustaining you becoming. Some paths are merely convincing imitations of purpose, offering movement without direction, activity without fulfillment, and recognition without depth. What you called mischances were often intersections you were spared from, because within them lay versions of your life that would have demanded less of your growth and more of your compromise. It is not always easy to recognize that a closed door can be an act of preservation rather than punishment, especially when the desire attached to it feels urgent and justified. Yet urgency is not always aligned with truth, and desire alone is not always evidence of destiny. There are moments when what you want and what you are meant for stand in different directions, and it is in those moments that closure becomes a silent correction rather than an ending. If you trace back through the pattern of what did not unfold for you, you may begin to notice a strange consistency. What was blocked often lacked permanence, what was denied often lacked depth, and what did not proceed often lacked the capacity to expand with you over time. It is as though an unseen intelligence was filtering your experience, not allowing your energy to be anchored in places that could not hold its weight in future seasons. In this way, closure was not randomness, but refinement, a narrowing of options that was secretly an expansion of direction. There is also a hidden discipline, being refused access to what you once desired because it forces the attention inward, toward development that does not depend on external approval or immediate reward. In the absence of those open doors, something else begins to form, a kind of internal alignment that becomes less negotiable with circumstance and more anchored in certainty that does not require validation. This is how strength is built without spectacle, how clarity is formed without noise, and how resilience becomes less of a reaction and more of a nature. And so what felt like obstruction was quietly shaping discernment, teaching you not just how to walk forward, but how to recognize which directions were worthy of your steps at all. What you call struggle was actually training for handling abundance without losing yourself, And this is where the hidden seriousness of your journey becomes clear, because abundance is not merely the arrival of more, but the test of whether more will distort you or reveal you. The human mind often imagines that the absence of ease is punishment, yet there are forms of difficulty that function like preparation chambers, where the weight you carry is not meant to break you but to strengthen the structure within you that will one day carry greater responsibility without collapse. There is a kind of unseen education that does not come through comfort, because comfort rarely asks anything of a person beyond maintenance, while struggle demands adaptation, reflection, and the slow construction of inner stability. In that sense, what you endured was not the absence of favor, but the introduction to capacity building, where each pressure point was quietly shaping your ability to remain grounded when life expands beyond familiarity. Many would desire abundance without understanding that it requires a kind of inner architecture capable of holding it without distortion if life had given you everything too early. Before the refinement of character and perception, it would have been like placing weight into a structure not yet reinforced. The collapse would not have been immediate in all cases, but gradual, subtle, and often mistaken for success. This is why struggle often arrives not as a barrier but as a stabilizer, ensuring that what is eventually given does not become something that consumes the person receiving it. There were moments when you likely felt that your path was unnecessarily heavy, as though you were carrying more than your share while others moved with less resistance. Yet resistance, though uncomfortable, is what develops the ability to hold direction when conditions are not favorable. It teaches persistence not as an idea, but as lived experience, where continuing becomes a decision made in the absence of encouragement rather than in its presence. And in those seasons, something deeper than endurance was being formed. It was discernment under pressure, the ability to distinguish between what merely appears valuable and what is genuinely sustaining. Struggle has a way of stripping illusions slowly, not through sudden revelation but through repeated encounters with reality, until superficial desires lose their authority over you and only what is essential remains compelling enough to pursue. There is also a refinement that occurs in the emotional structure during such times, where dependency on external validation begins to weaken and a more stable internal reference begins to emerge. This is not detachment from life, but recalibration within it, where worth is no longer measured by immediate outcomes but by consistency of direction. In this way, struggle becomes a quiet tutor in independence, not by isolating you from the world, but by ensuring you are not defined by its fluctuations. And so, what felt like heaviness was actually preparation for carrying weight that does not crush, but expands you. You are entering a phase where effort begins to multiply into visible results, and what once felt like silent movement is now beginning to take shape in ways that can no longer remain hidden beneath delay or uncertainty. There is a moment in every life where unseen work starts to surface into observable reality, not because effort suddenly becomes greater, but because timing begins to align with what has already been built beneath the surface for far longer than anyone could measure from the outside. It is important to understand that this shift does not arrive as a sudden miracle detached from you past, but as the natural unveiling of what has already been forming through persistence, endurance, and quiet continuation when nothing seemed to respond. The results you are beginning to witness are not separate from your effort. They are the continuation of it, entering a phase where invisibility is no longer required for growth. There is a subtle transition that occurs when inner preparation reaches a threshold where it can no longer remain concealed. What was once internal strengthening begins to reflect externally in opportunities, recognition, and forward movement that feel less like chance and more like recognition of alignment. It is not that the world suddenly changes its behavior toward you, but that what you have become begins to interact differently with the same world. In this stage, effort begins to behave differently. It is no longer only about pushing forward against resistance, but about recognizing where movement is already being supported by unseen convergence. The same actions that once felt like uphill striving begin to carry a sense of momentum, as if less friction exists between intention and outcome. This does not eliminate discipline, but it changes its texture from strain to direction. And yet, this phase also requires awareness, because visible progress can be more disorienting than visible struggle. When results begin to appear, there is a temptation to attribute them entirely to recent action rather than to the long accumulation that made those actions effective. This is where humility becomes essential, not as self-diminishing thought, but as accurate perception of time and cause, recognizing that what unfolds now is the outcome of what was sustained when nothing rewarded it there is also a deepening responsibility that comes with this shift. Because visible results tend to attract attention, and attention tends to test whether growth was only situational or truly integrated. This is why the earlier seasons mattered so deeply. Because they were not only producing outcomes, but forming stability that would not collapse under recognition. What is now emerging externally is being supported internally by everything you learned when there was nothing to show and sow. What you are stepping into is not sudden success, but the visible phase of continuity, where effort and outcome begin to resemble each other closely enough that the distinction between struggle and reward starts to blur into one ongoing movement forward. The energy around you is shifting toward recognition, opportunity, and expansion. And it is not a shift that announces itself with noise, but one that becomes noticeable only when you look back and realize that the weight you once carried is no longer the same weight that surrounds you now. There are changes in life that begin internally, long before they are reflected externally, as though reality itself first adjusts its unseen structure before presenting the visible outcome of that adjustment. What you are sensing now is not imagination, but transition. It is the subtle reordering of circumstances that begins when inner endurance reaches a point where it no longer needs to be tested in the same way. Life, in its deeper pattern, does not move randomly between seasons. It moves in response to what you have become capable of holding without breaking. And so, when expansion begins, it is not introduced as something foreign, but as something that finally fits recognition. In this sense is not merely about being seen by others, but about being placed in positions where what you carry within you is no longer invisible or delayed. It is the alignment between readiness and opportunity, where effort is no longer spent proving existence, but expressing what has already been formed through time and persistence. In such moments, what once required explanation begins to require only presence. Opportunity, when it arrives in this phase, often appears less like a dramatic opening and more like a series of quiet permissions that gradually widen the path in front of you. You may notice that doors do not always burst open at once, but rather begin to loosen, to respond, to acknowledge your continued movement toward them. This is how expansion often begins, not as explosion, but as permission that accumulates. There is also a refinement in the nature of what comes toward you. It is no longer only about possibility, but about suitability, as though life is beginning to match you. Internal development with external placement. What is not aligned begins to fall away more naturally, not through force, but through irrelevance, while what is aligned begins to persist with increasing clarity in this shifting energy. Even your perception of timing begins to change. What once felt delayed begins to appear precisely positioned, and what once felt uncertain begins to reveal itself as preparation for this very stage. Expansion is rarely loud in its arrival, but it is unmistakable in its consistency, because it changes not only what you experience, but how reality responds to your movement within it. And so what surrounds you now is not accidental acceleration, but the beginning of alignment made visible, where recognition, opportunity, and expansion begin to gather around what you have already become. What once required force will now begin to flow with unexpected ease and timing. And this shift is not the removal of effort, but the removal of unnecessary resistance that once surrounded your effort like unseen weight in the air. There are seasons in life where every step feels like negotiation with obstacles. And then there are seasons where movement begins to resemble agreement with reality itself, as though the world is no longer resisting your direction in the same way it once did. This transition is not accidental comfort, it is earned fluidity. It is what happens when persistence has already shaped the path so repeatedly that what once felt obstructed has been gradually worn into openness through consistent continuation. You are not entering a life without effort, but a life where effort is no longer constantly opposed by friction that does not belong to your purpose. Ease, in this deeper sense, is not laziness or absence of challenge, but alignment between intention and environment. It is the condition in which action no longer feels like displacement, but placement, where what you choose to do begins to feel supported by circumstances rather than resisted by them. Timing begins to play a more visible role, as if events are no longer arriving randomly, but responding to an internal rhythm that has been developing quietly within you. There is also a subtle recalibration happening in how outcomes respond to action. Previously, effort may have felt disproportionate to results, as though much was being given for little return. But in this new phase, even small movements begin to carry greater reach, not because the action itself has changed, but because the resistance surrounding it has diminished. This is what creates the experience of flow, where progress feels less like strain and more like continuity. And yet, this ease should not be mistaken for passivity. It still requires awareness, discernment, and presence, because flow can only be sustained when attention remains aligned with direction. The difference is that you are no longer constantly battling the conditions around you just to maintain forward motion. Instead, motion itself begins to carry a sense of cooperation with what is unfolding. There is a quiet intelligence in this kind of timing, where opportunities appear not as interruptions, but as responses. You begin to notice that certain things arrive precisely when internal readiness and external possibility intersect, creating moments that feel less like effortful pursuit and more like natural convergence. And so, what once demanded force begins to reveal a different law operating beneath it, a law in which alignment reduces friction, timing refines outcomes, and movement begins to feel like participation in something already unfolding. Rather than struggle against something resisting, you are no longer chasing outcomes. You are stepping into what was already moving toward you. And this is the quiet reversal that most people never recognize until they are already inside it. For so long, it may have felt as though life required pursuit, as though everything meaningful had to be extracted through effort, resistance, and persistence against uncertainty. But there comes a point where the direction of experience subtly shifts, and what once felt distant begins to behave as if it was never truly apart from you. This is not the end of effort, but the end of fragmentation. The sense that you are separated from what you are meant to receive begins to dissolve, replaced by the recognition that alignment has been forming even in the seasons where nothing seemed to respond. What is arriving now is not suddenly appearing, but finally reaching you after having been in motion long before your awareness could confirm it. There is a deeper truth hidden beneath this transition. You were never only moving toward outcomes. Outcomes were also moving toward the version of you that would eventually be capable of holding them without distortion. In that sense, every stage of delay, struggle, redirection, and quiet preparation was part of a mutual convergence, where both you and your path were being adjusted until meeting became possible in a stable form. And so, what feels like arrival is often recognition rather than discovery. It is the moment where effort no longer defines identity, and pursuit no longer defines direction. Instead, there is a steadiness that begins to emerge, where life is no longer experienced as something being hunted, but something being met halfway with increasing clarity and inevitability. In this state, even desire changes its character. It becomes less restless, less urgent, and more precise, as though it is no longer pulling you forward blindly, but revealing what has already been structurally prepared for you to inhabit. What you once reached for begins to feel closer not because it moved, but because you have moved into alignment with it. There is also a quiet relief that comes with this realization. Though it is not loud or emotional in the way relief is often imagined, it is more like the settling of internal tension, the release of constant anticipation that something must still be forced into existence. You begin to notice that continuity replaces pursuit, and participation replaces struggle, and so, you are not stepping into a life that is suddenly new, but into a reality that has been approaching you in parallel all along, where what you become and what you receive are no longer separated by distance, but joined in the same unfolding movement.